Okay, hello everyone and good afternoon and welcome to today's Geo lecture. We're really excited today to be joined by Leanne Hunt from Coventry University. And we're going to be talking a bit about how to live with risk and the challenges of living in an area at risk and how planning and education can help these communities stay informed and prepared for when they need to act. There is a chat bar on the side, so if you have any questions about the lecture throughout, please just leave them there and Leanne and I will answer them at the end. But please just remember to keep them polite and on the topic. And I think that's everything. I will pass over to Leanne now, and we hope you enjoy.
Thank you. Thanks, Harriet, and thanks everyone for having me here today. I hope you find this interesting and enjoyable. There is a slide right at the end with my name on, and if you have any questions that you think of afterwards, if you want to contact Harriet, or there's a link to our course page, you'll be able to find me through that as well. So I'm the course director at Coventry University for all our disaster management courses, but in a previous life, if you like, I was an emergency planning officer or a disaster manager, as they're often more commonly known, for local authority. So I've kind of almost been both sides of the coin, if you like, both sides of the fence when it comes to disaster management. So I've got some industry practice combined with sort of my academic and research experience. And I'll tap into my to both of those elements a little bit as we go through. So I was asked to talk to you a little bit around some of the things you've been discussing on seismology, on seismic risk, tectonics. And so I thought it was quite a good idea to start with a reminder of this almost constant risk that we have from these tectonic hazards. So this is just one image from one of the two earthquakes that Croatia suffered last year, perhaps a country where we don't necessarily automatically think of when we think of tectonic risks. But there are a number of countries in Europe where we do have these tectonic risks, as I'm sure you're aware. So these two in Croatia, they were quite big, really, in terms of impact. In terms of seismology, depending on who you speak to, they may say these are a moderate level earthquake in terms of their magnitude. But in terms of impacts, these were quite big. And that first earthquake there on the 22nd of March, that was the biggest earthquake to hit Croatia in 140 years. So when we come to talk a little bit later about understanding risk, the fact that something hadn't happened in such a long time, that becomes very important in helping us understand and communicate risk, because that is out of anyone's living memory. You know, that previous big earthquake in 140 years, there's no one alive that I know of that remembers something that happened 140 years ago. And then this again was obviously followed by an even stronger earthquake. And this kind of thing, again, is something that I'm going to touch on as we go through. We then had another earthquake that impacted Turkey and Greece. You may remember hearing about this. So this was end of October, a large magnitude earthquake, magnitude 7, which actually caused a small tsunami, so had a secondary hazard. And that's something that can make earthquakes even riskier, even scarier, if you like, for a lot of people, particularly in coastal areas where they're perhaps impacted by stronger earthquakes, and they can have these knock-on secondary impacts. But the tsunami bulletins were issued within 8 to 11 minutes, so quite quick in terms of being able to get warnings out there. There were over 100 deaths, but a good chunk of these really were from the earthquake itself and not from the tsunami. It was only a small tsunami in terms of scale, but over 1,400 aftershocks, many of which were over magnitude 4, which for an aftershock is quite significant and still has the ability to cause a level of destruction where we've already got weakened structures. But quite worthy of note, both Greece and Turkey sit, I should say on fault lines, sorry, not in a fault line. They sit on fault lines, as does Italy, which we will come on to in a second. So I just wanted to show you this. I screenshotted this on the 3rd, so last week, probably getting on for a week ago. This is from the US Geological Survey website, and you can go onto their website and get an overview of earthquake activity. So you can filter this a little bit, as you can see down this right-hand side, to look at earthquakes in the last day, the last 7 days, 30 days, etc. And you can do this on a USA scale, or a global scale, or of given magnitudes. So this was significant earthquakes in the previous 30 days, so going back from last week. And I just wanted to show you this, just to highlight how often these earthquakes occur. And if you looked at this on a scale of all magnitudes, you would see a lot more. So you can see here, I've sort of pinpointed a couple. So we've got this blue dot. This is the Philippines earthquake that's shown in the bottom corner here. There was some strong shaking, but it was light damage. There was low risk to life, and there was no tsunami expected. So this is the kind of information that we can start to glean from earthquakes, and we can use this in a variety of ways, which again I'm going to talk about as we go through. But I just wanted to give you an idea of kind of the frequency of earthquakes. And by significant earthquakes, I think that is anything over a magnitude 4.5 when you look on these filters. And that is just in the last 30 days. So, you know, to all intents and purposes, that's in the last month, where we've seen earthquakes. And a number of these were of a significant magnitude. So I briefly mentioned Italy a second ago, and the impact that fault lines have on Italy. For anyone who has never been to Italy, it is a magnificent place, full of lots of art and history and culture. The Italians are very proud of their history, but it's kind of got this little bit of a dark side in terms of its risk. So one of the biggest risks that they face in Italy is their tectonic risk. They're like everywhere else. They suffer with things like severe weather and flooding, obviously going through COVID at the minute, just like we are. But they've got this big tectonic risk that not many other countries in Europe have to deal with. So they've got the most number of active volcanoes in Europe. They've got a number of active volcanoes, and one of those is Mount Vesuvius, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And one of the reasons I kind of picked out Mount Vesuvius as a volcano to think about in terms of risk is just the sheer scale of the risk. So I don't know if you can see hopefully you can see my mouse hovering over the top here. But all this around here at the bottom of Vesuvius on this left-hand picture, this is all the city of Naples, and the amount of people that kind of live in the shadow of the volcano and are at risk of the volcano is immense. And we only have to look at this right-hand image here. This is an image of Pompeii, where you can see the volcano in the background. And we can look back at history and see what this volcano did to that historic city of Pompeii, to really understand what this volcano is capable of. And there's a lot of work that goes on around this volcano to try and reduce the risk, and to really, it's the most heavily monitored volcano in the world because of that risk, because of the amount of people that are at risk of death, injury, total destruction, really, if this volcano blows. So we're going to come back to Vesuvius. This is a document you may find useful depending on whereabouts you are in your studies and where your interests are. This is a document that was produced by the European Commission on the global exposure to natural hazards. It's called the Atlas of the Human Planet. So there's some really interesting information here about how our risk as a human race, our risk to natural hazards is increasing. And it's increasing at quite a rapid rate. So there's been a 93% increase in the number of people that are living in areas that are under a seismic risk, if you like. So at risk of earthquakes, volcanoes, across the globe, across Europe, sorry. This is on a European scale. And one of the things we need to bear in mind is that whilst we've got that increasing number of people living in areas that are at risk from earthquakes, volcanoes, etc., the risk is uneven and the vulnerability is uneven. So the people that are vulnerable to this risk, it's kind of unevenly spread across Europe. So obviously here in the UK, we've got a much lower risk from earthquakes. We do get some earthquakes, but they're very low level. Don't have to worry about a volcano erupting because we haven't got any active volcanoes. But if you look at some of the data that is behind this document, there are over 170 million people at risk of an earthquake in Europe, but 80% of those people live in Italy, Romania, and Greece. So, you know, that the remaining 20% is spread around the rest of those European countries. So it's very uneven. Very focused where that risk is. So why do we live in these dangerous places? There's a Padlet in, hopefully in the chat box for you to have a look at. But equally, if you're just happy to kind of put some comments in the chat or shout out why you think we live in these dangerous places, that would be good. Harriet, I can't see the screen anymore. So if anything comes in the chat regarding that, will you just let me know?
I will. There's a little bit of a delay between YouTube and where we are, so it sometimes takes a few moments.
Okay.
Somebody is just saying farmers live there for fertile soils, also cheap housing. Yep. Somebody else, mineral resources and mining. We've got another agriculture, all along the right lines, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do. One of the brilliant things about Mount Vesuvius in particular, if you've ever been to that area, the tomatoes that are grown on the side of Mount Vesuvius are absolutely to die for. They are wonderful, really flavoursome, lovely flavour. But that obviously comes with a risk. We've got really nutrient soils, brilliant for growing things like tomatoes. Lemons are another one in that area. But obviously, it's a bit of a trade-off. You know, Vesuvius hasn't had a significant eruption since the 1940s. So it's all been quite relaxed almost. And we've been able to utilise that land and that fertile soil. And we have to weigh that up. Some of the other issues come around money, being able to, if we realise we're in an at-risk area, being able to move away. And that also links into things like, you know, availability of jobs as well. And some of this comes back to culture and heritage. So we may not want to move away from where we are for a risk that we may perceive to be something that's only likely to happen, you know, once in a blue moon, or even if at all. There are some people that, this is potentially some people that are living in that area of Naples, in that Bay of Naples, that have been born since the last eruption and have not really seen much activity from the volcano. It's not in their living memory. So it's just been sat there dormant for all this time as far as they're concerned. You know, what is their perception of that risk? And to them, the risk may be low enough that they're kind of happy to be where they are.
Yes. Yeah, Grace has touched on that unplanned urbanisation, particularly around places like Mount Vesuvius. A few others coming in, both from Padlet and YouTube, are heating and the geothermal energy and tourism. We've also got a fantastic picture of Mount Etna in relation to tourism.
Brilliant. Yes. I've been to both these volcanoes in a tourist guise, if you like. So yeah, we are inquisitive as human beings, and especially people that don't perhaps live in these countries where we have these volcanoes. We're curious about them. They pull in the tourists. They pull in different kinds of tourists, so sort of scientific tourists and ones with just sort of a general interest. And the unplanned urbanization, that is another interesting one. So we sometimes have, particularly around cities, this unplanned urbanization. And sometimes that is in the form of what I would call more kind of, although it's unplanned urban organization, we probably have more kind of rigorous structures, if you know what I mean. Whereas sometimes we have sort of slum type areas that build up. And that can sometimes happen as a result of a disaster, or again, just in terms of people haven't got the money to go anywhere else, but perhaps they can't afford a house in the main bit of the city, and they kind of start to expand out perhaps on land that that they have or have access to, that they own. So start to build these more informal communities and structures. And again, it's that trade-off between what we need in day-to-day life against this risk that may not occur in our lifetime. So it's good, thank you. So can we live with risk? We are all very much living with risk at the moment, and there is that big elephant in the room around the big risk we're all dealing with at the minute, and I don't really want to dwell on that too much, partly because it's got nothing to do with tectonics, and partly because in my experience, in my teaching and in personal life at the moment, I think we are all COVIDed out. But we are living with a risk, and sometimes we do just have to try and live with a risk as best we can. But there are things that we can try and do. And these kind of ways of trying to manage and deal with risk are becoming more and more important as we increase as a population, as a global population, as things like climate change come more and more into force. We're seeing that there's more and more of us are having to live with an increasing amount of risk. So some of this, apologies if you've touched on this already in some of your other classes, but for many natural hazards, we've got ways of being able to monitor hazards and therefore risk and create forecasts. So for a lot of things like drought, for flooding, for hurricanes, for severe weather, we can do an awful lot of monitoring. We're getting quite good now at monitoring weather systems, for example. And we can turn that monitoring into a forecast, and we can tag a certain amount of certainty to that forecast that we're able to give. And there's always a margin of error. There has to be, because nothing is certain. But we're getting a lot better at the science behind all of that and turning that into something useful in a sort of public facing way. And to an extent, we can even do this for volcanic eruptions. And that's something where we're getting a bit better when it comes to the tectonic hazards. I said about Vesuvius being perhaps the most, arguably the most monitored volcano in the world. Not too far behind is Mount Etna, which somebody's already mentioned. And Etna is also very closely monitored, and we can start to look for increases in activity that perhaps suggest something is brewing. And again, something to look at in a second. But none of this, whether it's tectonics, whether it's flooding, hurricanes, even what some scientists have tried to do now around COVID, None of this is an exact science. There is always a margin for error, and we've got to try and do the best we can. But I've put a note at the end there. Earthquakes are a different kettle of fish, and they are. And I've talked about this with some of our students over the last couple of weeks. Trying to monitor, forecast, predict an earthquake is incredibly difficult. And there are some ways that we are trying to do this now, but even more so than those other natural hazards, definitely not an exact science and one that we can be certain about when we're trying to give warnings. So monitoring volcanoes, Mount Vesuvius is the one I've kind of stuck with as our example to work through. Mount Vesuvius is one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world, and therefore one of the most monitored, as I have said. There's approximately 3 million people living in a 20-mile radius of the crater of that volcano. And not only does that encompass Italians that, or other nationalities that live there on a daily basis, but like someone has quite rightly said, obviously in normal times when we're not dealing with a pandemic, there's an awful lot of tourists that go to this area, to the Amalfi Coast, which is just around the corner, and to Naples itself. If you've never been, I do recommend Naples. It's a brilliant cosmopolitan type city, an awful lot going on. But 3 million people living in the shadow of that volcano, and a significant chunk of those living in what they call the red zone, which is the area that is most at risk if an eruption happens. So I think it's around 600,000 live in that area. So there's lots of monitoring going on Mount Vesuvius. There's several dozen sensors dotted across not only the volcano itself, but the wider area. And they monitor the volcano 24/7. And these sensors look for different things. So different sensors looking at different things. They're looking for changes in seismic activity. So is there movement of the earth? Have we got some small earthquakes going on? Things like this. Gas emissions. So different gases can be emitted when the volcano is getting ready to kind of do something, when there's a build-up of pressure. And then changes in the soil and the landscape. So I don't know if you guys have ever looked at the Mount St Helens eruption in 1980, but that was one where they were able to monitor a change in the landscape and the form of the volcano. They kind of saw this hump on its back, if you like, starting to appear. And that was a collection of lava, a lava dome, that eventually gave way. But we can start to look for those kind of changes in the landscape and any changes in the soil. And this monitoring can help scientists predict that perhaps something is going to happen. They do the same kind of thing on many other volcanoes across the world, Mount Etna included. Mount Etna, they also go and take the temperature of the volcano, which as a mother, that made me chuckle a little bit thinking about taking temperatures. But they've got some very scientific kits where they can take a temperature and also monitor things like that, see if things are getting, there's an increase in temperature nearer the surface. That suggests we've got more magma coming towards the surface. Like I said, this isn't always an exact science. So we can think that something may be building and, issue a warning, and then maybe something doesn't happen. So we've got to be very careful. We don't want that boy that cried wolf syndrome, but there is a way that we are starting to understand the behavior of volcanoes a little bit more, that allows us to give some warnings, to be able to allow the community to take some preventative actions where possible. So this just shows you some of the seismic monitoring stations and some of the other monitoring stations around Vesuvius. So over here, this is Vesuvius here. This is the volcano, but you can see the monitoring stations are spread around, looking for different activity. So this is over here. We're getting towards where there's some some other volcanic activity that goes on around the, I can never say it, the Phlegonian fields. And again, monitoring stations around there, where we're monitoring for those, for the seismic activity and the changes in gases and landscapes, like I talked about. So spread out quite nicely across the area. Now, earthquake monitoring we can do, and that US Geological Survey screenshot that I showed you towards the beginning, that's an example of how we can do this. It's actually a task that we set, or we used to set our first year geography and disaster management students, actually, for one of their courseworks, was to go on that website and kind of find a main earthquake that happened and kind of go back in time and look for any earthquake activity before that, that, you know, they could maybe have said that was an idea that the big one was going to happen. So there are ways that we can do this, and there's lots of different organizations that do this. So there's the US Geological Survey, we have the British Geological Survey, there's the Global Seismographic Network, and so on. So there's lots of different networks that monitor seismic activity across the world. What we haven't done yet, and what we haven't been able to do, is perfect the art of saying when and where that big one, the big earthquake, is going to happen. All we can work on is historic data. But we can look for signs that something may be on its way. And again, not an exact science, but there are things we can look at. So we can look for clusters of smaller earthquake activity. So if you go back to some earthquakes, so the L'Aquila earthquake in 2009 in Italy, for example, if you go back through the data, what you will see is that before the main earthquake that they had in April in 2009, over the previous year even, there was clusters of smaller earthquakes that were occurring. So we can potentially look at those, particularly in areas that may have been quiet for some time. We can start to look where there may be some activity brewing, if you like, which could be a precursor for a bigger event. What some scientists are also doing are monitoring gas emissions. And again, not an exact science, but it is something that can suggest some buildup of tension, some changes in tectonic movement. Again, going back to the L'Aquila example, there was a scientist that had noted this before the L'Aquila earthquake. Again, this might be something you've looked at, but there was a scientist who monitored radon gas for a hobby, basically. And he was convinced, after reading some research that had been done in Turkey, he was convinced that he could do this to try and predict when an earthquake was going to happen. And he tried to raise the alarm in L'Aquila and was actually arrested for it I think it was about a week before the main earthquake actually happened. He was told that he shouldn't be telling people these things. He's causing panic. He shouldn't be doing this. And then sometime later, the earthquake actually happened. And then a number of scientists were arrested for not listening to this guy and hauled into court. So it was all a bit of a political mess. But it's not an exact science. But these are just some of the things we can monitor to try and establish whether or not something is going to happen. But even if we could say that gas emissions, that clusters of smaller earthquake activity are a precursor, are a sign that, you know, a bigger earthquake is coming, what we can't do is pinpoint the when and the where and the magnitude. So if, you know, on a volcano, we see increases in seismic activity or in different gas emissions, we know where the volcano is. We can give some warning to the, you know, to the people, to the population in that area. With an earthquake, it's so much harder. You know, we might be able to say, okay, there's been a cluster of activity around the Apennines in Italy, so we may be brewing for an earthquake in central Italy somewhere in the next couple of years, maybe. It's really woolly at the minute in terms of trying to be able to predict an earthquake. But seismologists, other scientists, they're working really hard on trying to be able to do this as accurately as possible, so we can try and save lives. Earthquakes kill an awful lot of people, unfortunately, and we don't want that. We want to be able to take people away from that risk when we can. But when you live in a country like Italy or like Turkey, like Croatia, even like parts of US, New Zealand, etc., there is that ever-present risk of being affected by an earthquake. So if we can try and, even if we can't perfect this way of predicting an earthquake, even if we can just get a little bit better at it, that we can maybe give some idea, it would obviously be really useful. If you can wave your phones at this now, or later when if you want to watch this back on YouTube, this takes you to the Global Seismographic Network, which is where a lot of different monitoring organizations come together and kind of input their data, share their data. It shows you where all the monitoring stations are situated when you click on this. I can't remember what it's called, on this little infographic here. It will take you through to that. So if you want to have a look at that in your own time, it's quite interesting where all the different stations are across the globe. So what can we achieve with monitoring? This image at the bottom here, this is a church destroyed in the L'Aquila earthquake, just for info. So what can we achieve? Monitoring is a great thing to do. And I know I've said, that particularly with earthquakes, just by monitoring, we can't necessarily predict when something is going to happen. But when we think about hazards as a whole, not just tectonic hazards, there's an awful lot we can achieve from undertaking monitoring. So by monitoring earthquake activity, we can start to understand what the risk is in more detail, perhaps in different areas of the world. So we know where key areas are for tectonic activity, for earthquake activity. And we can start to try and identify patterns and where we can perhaps, although we can't predict with accuracy the next earthquake, we can identify patterns that show us perhaps where the most at-risk areas are, for example. Accurate monitoring can allow us to give some warnings. So like I was saying, for things like different weather systems, for things like drought, for example, we can give warnings by monitoring things like rainfall. For monitoring rainfall and groundwater levels can help give us an idea of whether we're heading towards a drought. And we can give warnings to the governments, to the agencies that are in charge and that would deal with these kind of disasters, to try and give them a heads up to put things in place, perhaps warn a community that might be affected. Monitoring can also give us an idea of potential locations of where hazards might happen, and sometimes even to sort of what extent something might happen. So flooding is a good example there. We can monitor river levels and sort of all the data associated with that. But we can also look at potential extents of the flooding. So there's ways that scientists, meteorologists can kind of work out where extents of flooding or where extents of severe weather systems are potentially going to have an impact on communities. And that helps plan for the impact of the hazard, but can also have an impact on things like developments. So if we've gone through a long period of monitoring and we've seen several flood events happen in a given area, and then someone puts in a planning application to build 50 houses in that particular area, we can use that monitoring data and the sort of historical flood data to feed into things like that for development planning, and then hopefully remove another element of risk for future generations. But like I've said, accurate prediction from monitoring is very hard. It's not an exact science, especially for the tectonic hazards that we're thinking about today. So especially for our earthquakes, if we can't solely rely on monitoring and prediction of, the when, the where, and the magnitude, then what else can we do to help us live with this risk? So this is the emergency planning or disaster management cycle, depending on which side of the pond you sit on. So in the UK, we use the term emergency. Most other countries use the term disaster. That is a separate lecture in itself that is for another time. But essentially, we're thinking about the same thing. So this is a cycle that disaster managers, emergency planners can use to help them prepare for an emergency, for a disaster. So in this cycle, there are a number of organisations that you would expect to be involved. So all your emergency services, which I'm sure you guys would probably expect, local governments, and then depending on where you are and what the hazard is, you would have a number of other agencies involved. So in the UK, for example, we have what we call category 1 and 2 responders, which are identified in our emergency planning legislation, which is called the Civil Contingencies Act. And our category 1 responders are the ones that have the most duties around this cycle and preparing for an emergency and responding to an emergency. And they are people like our emergency services, our local councils, the Environment Agency, Public Health England, different parts of the NHS. The NHS is a bit funny when we get into this. So parts of the NHS are in category 1, parts are in category 2. Our category 2 responders are people like our utility companies, Transport for London, for example, London Underground, people like that, that potentially have a part to play, but not necessarily in every emergency. So it's probably a little bit more focus for them. So we have our hazard event where our risk is. So our hazard event for us, if we take our earthquake, happens, and in this part of the cycle, we're looking at the hazard itself, so how severe it was, and then we're looking at the vulnerabilities and the impacts. So who's been affected by our earthquake, where has it happened, the extent of any damage, and who do we need kind of out on the ground, what do we need to do? And that kind of leads us into this response phase. So emergency services on the ground, we're doing search and rescue, we're evacuating people to a safe area, to a rest centre, to an evacuation centre, where they can have shelter, warmth, food, drink, they can take their pets, and we can deal with, perhaps in these areas, we can deal with what we call like the walking wounded. So people with sort of cuts and scrapes that don't need that hospital treatment. But also as part of the search and rescue, we're taking people away and we're taking them to hospital. And then also what we might have is an influx of people coming in. So aid agencies, people like Save the Children, the International Federation of the Red Cross, Action Aid, these kind of people we might start to see coming in and providing support, whether that's through first aid support, search and rescue, providing emotional support and things like this. So we start to go into the response phase. When we go into recovery, we're looking at much longer term. So we're thinking about rebuilding of structures. We're thinking about providing longer term psychological and emotional support. And we're thinking about also moving into this next phase. So what have we learned during all of this that can help us prevent this happening again? So if we're going into long-term recovery and we're looking at having to rebuild from our earthquake, we need to be thinking about this next step. So prevention and mitigation. So when we're rebuilding our buildings, what can we do to try and stop the same level of destruction next time? So, you know, making our buildings more seismic proof, if you like, for want of a better term. And we go into things around preparation. So this is for not only for the communities involved, but also for emergency services, for those emergency responders, all those different organisations that were involved in the response to this, in the recovery. So what can we do to help us prepare for an event in the future? So this is where we have things like emergency plans or disaster management plans in place that tell us how we're going to deal with this if it happens again, and what kind of actions do we need to take, who's in charge, which agency is going to do what, you know, what other things need to be considered. And for a community, that can be around understanding the risk and taking some more preventative actions, which we are going to look at in a second. So disaster managers or emergency planners have a crucial role in helping us live with risk. And the approach to how they do this, and indeed the approach to their job in general, is not uniform across all countries. So depending on where you are in the world, there are perhaps different priorities within your national government. So perhaps there isn't a focus on this, same at a local government level. It may not be a priority. There may be issues around funding for these, you know, for people in these posts, or for putting certain procedures or plans in place. There may be differences in laws in terms of what your law around disaster management tells you need to do. In some countries, there may not even be a law that tells you what you need to do. In most cases there are, but it's different in terms of what it says you need to do and how serious a government is about enacting all of that and carrying that out. But disaster management agencies and governments should do a number of things, and I've underlined that should, because not everybody, not every country, not every government, not every agency involved will do this. And not only does that vary across countries, but it can also vary, you know, in a given country across different regions, across different areas. So disaster management agencies, by that I mean some countries set up a disaster management agency. Guess you've all heard of like FEMA, for example. But then that also includes the agencies I'm talking about here, also includes things like your emergency services. Governments are at all levels of government, etc., and people like our Environment Agency and things like that. So things that they should do. Horizon scanning. So by that I mean looking out there. What are the risks? What risks do we face? And we can look at that on a historical level. So what have we faced in the past? Understanding our geographical area. So understanding our tectonic risk. You know, are we sitting on a fault line? Are we near a plate boundary, for example? You know, what kind of risks do we look like? Do we have? And we undertake risk assessments based on the risks that we think could be applicable to us. So we start to look at, you know, what that risk is, what the likelihood is of it happening, what the impacts might be. So we start to look at those kind of things. And again, I'm going to talk about that in a second. We need to look at what our agency who we're working for, what our capabilities are in terms of responding to these risks. What capacity have we got to respond to those risks? So have we got if we are a fire service, have we got personnel that are trained in urban search and rescue, you know, searching collapsed buildings? Have we got that capability within our organisation? And if we've got the capability, have we got the capacity to then enact that during an emergency, during a disaster? Have we got the right kit? Have we got the right specialist kit? Have we got geothermal cameras? Have we got search dogs? Have we got heavy lifting equipment? Have we got, you know, all of that? And if we haven't, have we got the capacity to have that? Have we got the funding to have that? Have we got the funding to train the people to do that? We should also be creating disaster or emergency response and recovery plans. So when risk A happens, what is the plan for how we deal with that? And what is the plan for how we recover from that? And within that plan, which agencies need to be involved? What are they going to do? And how is it all going to be managed and coordinated? And then a big one for us, I think, is around educating communities on the risks that they face. Because it's no good if we as disaster managers know that that area is at risk of earthquakes, if the people that live in that area have absolutely no idea. Because then when something does happen, they may not be sure initially of what is happening. There is the potential to cause panic, although this is often less likely than what some media, for example, would have you believe. But we want to be able to facilitate them in kind of taking any sort of preventative actions or actions to sort of prepare themselves for an event like this. And those really good practices that we see in disaster management really put communities at the focus of all of this work that they do. And that is something that increasingly we're seeing calls for different governments and different agencies to do. So we need to identify and understand the risks for us to be able to know how to live with risk. So I mentioned undertaking a risk assessment, and this can be aided by the scientific community and by looking at historical data. And historical data can be quite important to us in this. So we need to know what hazards are known and what do we know about them. So if we know we're at risk of floods, what floods have we experienced in the past? What was the scale of that flooding? Where did it happen? What was the depth of the water? What extent did it go to? How many people were impacted? You know, how many buildings were impacted, etc. And then what were the impacts on things like the economy as well, and the sort of social makeup in these communities? And where are the vulnerabilities in our community? So do we have a different language in our community to what is our native language, for example? Do we have an international community almost? Do we have different vulnerabilities in terms of an elderly population, for example? So we need to kind of understand all of that. And then we also need to try and work out what hazards we kind of know less about, or that are maybe even unknown to us. So going back to our initial, one of my initial slides there on Croatia, and that was the first earthquake they'd had in 140 years. That was a lesser known risk and hazard that, you know, we would potentially need to identify and try and work out what the impacts would be. And we can use all of this historical data that we have on previous events, and we can do different types of statistical analysis to work out what the likelihood is of a given event occurring again in a given time frame of a given magnitude or severity. So there are ways that we can do that to try and work out what the risk is. One of the things that we need to be mindful of is that often the most frequent hazards can have a lower impact. If we see sort of repeated low-level flooding events, for example, they tend to have less of an impact versus that, you know, real big earthquake or the massive Category 5 hurricane, for example. And also they're more well known to the people, to the communities. So they're more familiar with it. They kind of, they know the drill. They know what they need to do and what they need to do afterwards to sort of get themselves back to normal again. But what we can do when we've done this analysis of historical and statistical data is put this into a more user-friendly visual representation. So this is where we start to see things like hazard maps. So you may have seen them even this week. I don't know where all of you guys are, obviously, but where I am, we've had quite a bit of snow this week. So we get a bit of a hazard map with our warning that, has the yellow or the amber warnings on them. And we can do that in that warning stage, and we can do that in that preparedness stage and show which areas are at risk of significant seismic hazards, for example. So going back to Vesuvius, the area sort of nearest the volcano itself on a hazard map is a very bright red colour, because that is the area that is most at risk if this hazard occurs. And they're a nice visual representation for us to show the community, but then somewhere else, behind all of that, there is, a scientist, an organisation that has a lot more data that kind of went into preparing that should they need it. So once we start to understand the risk, we can then start to inform our communities about the risk. But we need to be very careful when we're doing this. So it needs to be done in a very methodical way, but also in a sensitive manner. So we don't want to go causing alarm. We don't want to confuse anybody. And we don't want to overwhelm a community by saying to them, okay, we've done a risk assessment and you're at risk of earthquakes, volcanic eruption, floodings, a hurricane, a tsunami, landslides. You go in with all that massive list of risks and you can completely overwhelm people. So it needs to be done in a very organized manner, with an element of discussion around what that risk looks like, putting it into context for the community. So one of the ways we can do this is sort of through education and risk awareness campaigns. So ideally, for this to work really well, we need cooperation at all levels of government and cooperation between the different organisations that are involved, and go for this multi-agency approach. So the community can also see that all the relevant agencies are working together on this and, are doing something about the risk, or trying to do something about the risk. So some countries may educate, if you like, on the most likely hazard to occur. So, those flood events that we maybe see on a more regular basis, or the severe weather, for example. And they may start with those to kind of build some of that rapport with the communities and get them familiar with the different agencies involved and what their roles are. Others may start with the less frequent but bigger impact events, the greater magnitude events. So they may start with something like, did you realise that we are sitting on a plate boundary, that we are at risk of an earthquake, for example? And then others take a more generalised, be prepared for a multitude of event type scenario. So there's lots of different ways to do this, and there's many arguments for which is the best way and which is not the best way to do this. And again, it's down to local context, and sort of local and regional, national relationships, and what funding is available, and what information is available. So some countries put an awful lot of money and time and dedication into this, others not so much. And again, there are reasons for that, which a lot of the time do come back to money, unfortunately. So just to give you an idea, I've put you the website again at the bottom if you want to have a look at this, if you've not seen it already. This is an example of the New Zealand approach. So these are screenshots from their website. They start off by saying, in New Zealand, we've got a lot of natural hazards that we are at risk of. And you click on each hazard and it tells you what to do before, during, and after an emergency related to this hazard. So these are the main ones that they are at risk of in New Zealand. There's another area that talks about how to get themselves prepared. So get yourself prepared at home, get yourself prepared at work, get yourself prepared at school. And there's some more sort of information that they put up there for schools on how they can prepare for any one of these emergencies, and get children and staff familiar with, with what they need to do. And educating children is increasingly becoming a way of increasing overall risk knowledge. So they say that for every child you educate, at least one adult, really, if not two, because child learns something at school and goes home and tells, mum, dad, granny, sister, next door neighbour, whoever. A child will usually, scientists believe, go home and tell someone what they learnt at school. So like here in the UK, we do fire drills. It's quite literally drilled into us from being at primary school, even at nursery now, and we do fire drills as part of the norm, and the fire bell goes off and we know what we need to do. In places like Japan and China and even Italy, I learned over the last couple of weeks, they do earthquake drills, and they become the norm, just like the fire drills do. So they have some education around, what an earthquake is and what it can do. And these are the actions we need to take. And this is why, like I say, it becomes kind of part of the way of life in school. Again, someone you may have heard of in your studies before, but Tilly Smith was a young girl that in 2004 was credited with saving around 100 lives in Thailand during the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And she saved those lives based on something she remembered doing in a geography class about tsunamis and how the water, how the ocean pulls back, how there's drawback, they call it, before a tsunami hits. And she remembered that. And I think she had to jump up and down and shout at people a few times, but her parents, trusted what she was sort of saying, what she'd remembered from school. And she was given a number of awards for subsequently saving around 100 lives, like I said. So education we really are starting to see more and more the benefits of educating in schools on hazards and, what the impacts might be and what actions people can take as a way of being able to educate the wider community and change those perceptions people have of risk. And that enables us to potentially live with this risk a little bit more. Another step that we might take as part of our either our education in schools or as our part of our sort of community risk awareness raising campaigns might be to encourage people to put together an emergency kit. So an emergency kit that you can have in your house, school, office, scout hut type thing, that if there was an emergency and you were going to be stuck for a few days without being able to leave your house, that you have everything in there that you might need. Now, I did some work back when I was an emergency planner. I did some work with a local scout group and I asked them what they would put in their emergency kit, and I had some fantastic answers. I had a jetpack, I had an Xbox, but I would be interested to hear what you guys think you would put in an emergency bag. So if I told you you had to put an emergency kit together to be able to survive upstairs in your house because the downstairs is flooded, and it's going to be 3 days before the emergency services are likely to be able to get to you to evacuate you because they're focusing on the vulnerable people first. You've got to kind of be self-sufficient for 3 days in the upstairs of your house. If you just want to pop in the chat some ideas of what you would put in your emergency kit, and then Harriet, if you wouldn't mind kind of shouting some out to me, please.
No worries. Let's just give people a moment. We'll see
Thank you.
Okay, so far we've got batteries for the torch from Shannon.
Yeah.
Kettle?
Ooh,
Depends if you like tea,
depends,
coffee.
yeah.
That
And
can
it
be
depends if you've got power to plug it in.
It does, yes. First aid kit is a good one.
Excellent one.
I think that might be it for the moment, but that's a good start.
It is a good start. So we talk about, when we give advice out to people on what to put in these kits, we talk about there's a set amount of water per person per day that is recommended by governments. Around for two of you, perhaps around 6 of those big bottles of, real big bottles of water, that might just about do it. But if you're thinking then that you also might want to wash yourself, you might want to put a little bit more in, or you might want to put in some baby wipes for that kind of thing. Some tinned food, don't forget the tin opener. And you may also want to put in things like non-perishable goods, or things with like a long sell-by date on. So you may want to throw in, some boxes of cereal bars, for example, or other things that have sort of longer dates on them. You can buy these big fancy emergency kits online for a fairly ridiculous amount of money, really, and they come with like the army food ration packs in and things like that. When I worked in emergency planning, we did have such a bag, and we actually tried one of those. Kind of recommend putting some of your own stuff in a bag if at all possible, because they're not the tastiest thing. But those kind of things to consider. Torch and radio, either batteries, like someone said, which is great to power those, or you can now get wind-up torches, which are quite good to use. But a radio is brilliant for being able to listen into local news to get any information on what's going on, what to do, how to contact people. They may wish to ask you to, put a sign in your window to identify that you're in your house and need rescuing, for example. Or if you still by some miracle got, a signal on your mobile after not being able to plug it in and charge it, ring this number, for example. First aid kit was a good one. Something to do, so if you're putting one of these kits together, chuck in a book and some puzzle books, pack of cards, something like that you, can kind of keep you occupied. And if you've got kids and pets, stuff to put in for them to keep them occupied, perhaps a change of clothes, a blanket, those kind of things. So I've put you some websites on there that kind of recommend different things to put in your emergency kits. If you haven't got an emergency kit at home, I would thoroughly recommend putting a bit of one together, and kind of having that to one side. When we first got whiff of COVID starting in China, that's the kind of thing that I started to put together. When I went shopping, I grabbed a couple of extra tins of baked beans. Would just like to say that there was no panic buying of toilet roll going on at any point. But when this started last January and we started to hear about it, just started to think of some of those things that we might need should we have to, sort of quarantine ourselves as a family. So can be useful for any kind of scenario. One of the other things that, particularly in this country, and in places like New Zealand and America, Australia, that local governments, local disaster management agencies, and on national levels are trying to encourage are these community and or household emergency plans. So there's some key considerations here that we need to think about. So for a community, we first need to think about what is our community. And again, we could do like weeks of lectures on how you define a community. But a lot of people think of it as a geographical area. So it might be your village or, your kind of suburb of the town or the city. So coming together as a group, perhaps in your community hall, before all of the bad stuff happens, and trying to put a community plan together. So who's going to lead on it? Are you going to have like a little project team? And if so, who's going to lead on it? So sometimes it's like the town mayor or people like this sometimes lead on it. It might be a prominent figure in your community, or someone just with a bit of experience or interest in this area. So who's going to lead on the project? When something actually happens, who's going to coordinate everything? And ideally, one of those two people needs to be the person that then links in with sort of local government emergency services as a conduit of information that says, we've put this community emergency plan together. Do you want to take a look at it? Tell us what you think. Have we missed anything? Is there anything you can feed into it? And keep that communication channel open. So when something does happen and you want to enact your community emergency plan, you've got that contact within that given organisation, and you can say to them, yes, we're affected. We're invoking our community emergency plan. This is what's happening. We'll kind of keep you posted. So in that plan, we need to think about what the risks are to our community. And then what resources have we got to help us with that? What capabilities, for example? So where I live, one of the biggest issues that our communities used to face, one of the biggest risks was, particularly out in the Wolds, was severe weather. So some of those community plans identified farmers that had got ploughs that that they could put on the front of tractors and clear roads for people to get through and things like that. Who's got a chainsaw that can chop up a tree that's fallen down? All those different kind of things. Who's got a forklift truck license, or who's licensed to drive a minibus, or things like that? Who's trained in first aid? Have we got any vulnerabilities in our people, in our community, or in our infrastructure? So have we got a flood bank that perhaps is weakened? Have we got some low-lying buildings that are perhaps below a seawall or below a flood defence because of how things have been structured? Have we got people in our community where perhaps they are deaf? They are people for whom English isn't a first language. Perhaps we've got, like I said, an elderly population. So we need to think about people that, if we ask them to evacuate, maybe can't get themselves there. Maybe they need someone to go and put them in help them into a wheelchair and take them down to wherever we're asking people to congregate. So those kind of things we need to start to understand. And when we understand all of that and what we've got in terms of people and resources, we can start to put together some action cards or some flow charts for different hazards. So when snow happens, when we get, severe weather, when we get snow, this is what's going to happen. This is who's going to do what. If it's flooding, this is what's going to happen. This is going to, be who does what. Like what we've got at the minute with COVID, for a disease. Again, this is what we can do. And the plans will potentially look very different and may have different people involved. But as long as we can identify who's going to do what and with what resources, and we have that, very crucially, that link with those responding organisations, then these can become really useful plans. If we look at it on a household level, again, what risks do we face as a household? Have we got any vulnerabilities in our household? So have we got granny living with us who is diabetic or something like that, or is on kidney dialysis? So if we lose water in a flooding event, they become, very vulnerable, for example. Are we in a bungalow? So if we suffer flooding and the advice is to go upstairs, we can't because we haven't got one. So we need to think about those kind of things. And start to think about what we would do in a range of different emergencies. So, if we are at risk of a volcanic eruption, if we're living in that red area around Mount Vesuvius, What will we do if the warning's given that an eruption is imminent? Where are we going to go? Have we got that grab bag or emergency kit ready to take with us? And if the warning comes when we're not all at home, where are we going to meet? So is there a, if the kids are at school and we're at work and the warning goes out, where are we going to meet to then sort of enact our plan and, go to wherever it is we want to go to? One of the key things I forgot to mention, which I've just remembered, in what to put in our emergency kit or bag, insurance documents, copies of insurance documents and of prescriptions. Because if you are asked to evacuate, you may wish to take that grab bag with you, that emergency kit with you. And if you've got a copy of your prescriptions and you've been evacuated and you haven't got your medication, that kind of speeds things up a little bit, and the same with your insurance documents. And that is kind of the end of where I am. I know that was all kind of very quick, and there's lots of different things that we can do to enable us to live with risk. And it is doable. There is a lot of actions we can take. And increasingly, those actions need to have the community at the very centre of all this disaster management, emergency planning that we are seeing, because the community know themselves much better than anyone else. So as long as we can inform them of the risk and what that risk looks like, and the kind of actions, that we would need them to take, we can really work together in this really positive sort of, two-way relationship in trying to live with risk and reduce that risk. If you are interested in all things disaster management and maybe fancy doing a degree, this is our course page here, and there is my email there for anyone if you have any questions.
Thanks, Leanne. That was great. I don't know if we've got any questions. We can hang about for a second in case there are any final questions. Yeah. But just to say, for anyone watching live, if you want to click on any of the links that Leanne's been pointing out, the presentation is available on the GEO website. So you can download that and follow up on any references or further reading. Let's see if we've got any questions. Not quite yet, I don't think. But it was really useful to hear all about risk and how people live with risk. It's not something I think that's always at our forefront of our minds here in the UK, because it's quite a developed country, and we don't have things like tsunamis and earthquakes happening on a regular basis. But for people in Japan, Italy, it is more at the forefront of their minds. So yeah, it's been useful insight, I think.
Sorry, I realised now looking at the time as well, I went a little bit over my hour, so apologies everybody.
That's okay. I don't have any questions, so we'll wrap it up, and I'm sure if they come in the comments, we can get back to them later. But thank you, Leanne, for giving your time for this project, and thank you everyone for watching today, and we hope you enjoyed.
Thanks everybody.